comes to mind is a desktop-sized printer that can produce three-dimensional objects. And some of these objects are quite useful. 3D printers can turn out anything from auto parts to acoustic guitars to camera lenses to prosthetic limbs. Amazing. That technology is now being applied on a far greater scale. 3D printing machines the size of a house can print prefabricated parts for an actual full-size house, or even a whole small house. And it can do it repeatedly and rapidly, which with each one being an exact replica of the preceding one. Thus, 3D printing is now an industrial production technology. A headline about this large-scale printing from a Digital Trends article reads, quote, "This giant 3D printer can build 10 prefab homes in under 24 hours. Now, given they're not huge homes, there's no second story, but 10 houses in 24 hours, that's remarkable. Just think how that could help provide shelters following a natural disaster, to say nothing of how it might eventually reduce the cost of everyday house construction. Now, churches are buildings too, of course, so we should expect that eventually new church edifices will be 3D printed as well. According to Dane Gordy, managing principal with Visioneering Studios Incorporated of Irvine, California, 3D printing of churches is still a little ways off. Gordy says, quote, 3D printing is still pretty experimental for architecture and construction. The actual time test for this technology hasn't been met yet, end quote. So the first churches produced using 3D printers will probably be very plain, very simple, humble dwellings for the divine. As humble as the first 3D printed churches may be, they will be better than what the ancient prophet was looking at in post-exile Jerusalem. Decades earlier, the Babylonian army had overrun Jerusalem. It destroyed the temple, the one that King Solomon built, the pride of Israel. And it was anything but humble. That temple had been magnificent. Now, back in Jerusalem, the returning exiles, under the urging of the prophet Haggai and Zechariah, had finally constructed a replacement temple. But it apparently was a modest structure in comparison to the previous one. Thus Haggai said to the people, "Who is left among you that saw this house in its former glory? How does it look to you now? Is it not in your sight as nothing?" The new temple must have looked like a 3D printed church, nothing more than a good start. But God promises more to come. "The latter splendor of this house shall be greater than the former, says the Lord of hosts. And in this place I will give prosperity, says the Lord of hosts." The temple would be eventually full-dimensional in the best sense of that term. Granted, the church of the post-Pentecost era is not a building made with hands or hammers, printed planters or people. The church is people. And while we, the people, are individuals and thus not reproducible in exact copies, there are three dimensions that apply to us nonetheless: height, breadth, and depth. The first dimension is breadth. Of the three, in recent years, churches have concentrated on breadth. We have tried to make our churches welcoming of a greater range of people that historically have been true of the church. Churches have done that by adding contemporary services, by making our bulletins more user-friendly, by preaching lots of love your neighbor sermons, by putting a coffee and pastry shop in the narthex. You know, the Christian Hebrews Cafe. Yeah. We don't use words like foyer or narthex, at least too much. We stay away from words like sanctuary, although it is that, is it not? We reach out with a helping hand in our neighborhoods. We have expanded our church by reaching and creating small groups that might be of interest to a whole range of people. And we have worked at eliminating racial barriers. The church has worked to become more open. It has elevated inclusivity and diversity to the level of virtues. And there's much good to be said for all of that. In some cases, however, the focus on breadth has been at the expense of height and depth. This second dimension of height is a problem because height is a starting point for what makes us the church. Height can represent for us the relationship we have with that which is higher than ourselves, our Creator, our God. But we can get so involved in the horizontal relationships that we fail to cultivate the vertical. 12-step programs such as Alcoholics Anonymous challenge the church not to forget height when printing a church. In these programs, the first step is to acknowledge that one is powerless by oneself to resist the addiction. The second step is to turn control of oneself over to a higher power. 12-step programs recognize that the people who turn to them for help have gotten the dimensions of their lives out of balance and have neglected the higher connection. One of the fascinating, but by no means the only, theory about why people use and abuse drugs and alcohol is that on some level people become aware of an emptiness within them, and the substance abuse is a way of trying to fill that which only can be filled by God. Centuries ago, St. Augustine put it, "You have made us for yourself alone, O God, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you." To translate this to church life, we know it is possible to enjoy the culture and the fellowship of the church without developing that higher connection to God, the God of the church, the God of the universe. When that happens, though, our brought him security and peace and could enable the promise of his life to fully develop, to blossom. We cannot build that relationship by nurturing only the breadth dimension of the church, as important as that is. Without height, there is always something missing in church. Thus, if we are to be a church of more than one dimension, we must always be seeking God's guidance in our worship, leading and listening for his word, and pointing the coming generations and newcomers to the Lord. Breadth, height, and thirdly, depth. Depth represents discipleship over the long haul. Most of us can take one of Jesus' teaching from the Sermon on the Mount and do it quite well for a little while. Being a peacemaker for a day isn't too hard, but, dear Lord, I haven't killed anybody today. But week after week, year after year, that's another thing altogether. Turning the other cheek, well, that's occasionally doable, but for many, cheek turning, making that a way of life, requires great commitment. Even praying for those who are a pain in the neck is possible. But being kind and charitable on a permanent basis towards those who seem to make everything as difficult as possible, that requires significant energy and spiritual depth. To that end, the prophet Habakkuk has something to say to us. In chapter 2, verse 4, he says, "The righteous live by their faith." The original Hebrew word for faith is emunah, which can also be translated as faithfulness. In Psalm 33, verse 4, emunah is used to describe God's work and is indeed translated as faithfulness. We can render the Habakkuk verse as the righteous will live by being faithful. In fact, that statement is the main point of the vision God gave Habakkuk, and it's the main point about which depth means to us as a people of Christ's church. Remaining faithful is not the most exciting posture in today's world. A world that favors instant gratification. Pastor and author Eugene Peterson wrote, quote, "One aspect of the world that I have been able to identify as harmful to Christians is the assumption that anything worthwhile can be acquired at once. We assume that if something can be done at all, it can be done quickly and efficiently. This is a great market for religious experience in the world." There is a great market for religious experience in the world. There is little enthusiasm for the patient acquisition of virtue. Little inclination to sign up for the long apprenticeship in which earlier generations of Christians called holiness. Give us a way to think about what perseverance in the Christian life is. Peterson borrows a phrase from the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. He describes the Christian life as, quote, "a long obedience in the same direction." And though the Apostle Paul didn't use that same vocabulary, he too had something like a long obedience in the same direction. He had that in mind when he told the Galatians, let's not get tired of doing good, because in time we'll have a harvest if we don't give up. The common thread in all of this is that though life may be hard, and there may be troubles, and there may be evildoers who will sometimes come out on top, steady faithfulness to God, enduring trust in God's assurance, perseverant reliance on God's strength, a long obedience in the Lord's direction, living holy every day, whatever terms we use to say it, that is the way to go. Death is the church's ongoing faithfulness. That death depends on the church's height, its vertical connection to Almighty God. And it pushes us to be a people of breadth as well. Is it finished, Brennan? So, great timing. If we're going to print a church, this is a kind of church to print. A 3D church with breadth, height, and depth. Let's pray. Father God, you have placed before us a challenge to grow in all manner. And so we appeal to you to guide our footfalls, to strengthen our ways, that we might be on your path to becoming your true church. Be with us now.